Tonight, we begin with an economic development that business executives just assumed was impossible. Trade analysts had increasingly feared it, and policymakers, well, they had desperately tried to negotiate it away. We're talking about a massive economic disruption that unfolded not over months of quiet diplomacy, but in a shocking, precise 72-hour window. 72 hours. That's all it took to fracture these incredibly integrated supply chains across 3 major manufacturing states. 72 hours that wiped billions, literally billions, off automotive stocks and just suspended production plans overnight. And maybe fundamentally altered the relationship between North America's 2 closest allies. What Canada did was cross an economic line that Washington desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the U.S. auto industry was hit with devastating, calculated force. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our sources detail exactly how and why America's most reliable partners shifted from, quiet restraint to aggressive retaliation.
What's so fascinating here is that the speed of the public event, it just completely obscured nearly 18 months of boiling tension. I've seen trade analysts struggling to find a good analogy for it, and the best one I heard, it compared it to a very tense family Thanksgiving dinner, where one sibling finally just snaps over some slight from a year and a half ago.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The damage is instant, but the source of the fight, it goes way, way back.
Because for that year and a half, there were these quiet, non-official indicators that Canada was preparing for the worst.
Yeah.
Things like scheduled trade negotiators suddenly being recalled, diplomatic back channels just going cold, and then these quiet coordination efforts ramping up with major partners in Europe and Asia.
Absolutely. And that's the tell. When Canada goes quiet on trade, you know something is about to get very loud. And the magnitude of this action, it really stems from a fact that I think many Americans miss, which is the sheer depth of our economic integration. We don't really have traditional trade across the border.
Right. We think of shipping containers crossing oceans. This isn't that.
Exactly. This is one single, highly optimized manufacturing ecosystem that's just, sliced down the middle by a border. We're talking about $400 billion in goods moving annually. The auto industry alone, that's nearly a quarter of that, $100 billion. So parts made in Ontario are integral to final assembly in Michigan. Engines from Ohio are essential to plants in Quebec. Canada didn't just impose a tax, they put a very specific, very expensive wrench into the finely tuned machinery of North American production.
And here's where the precision of the retaliation really sets this deep dive apart. Early this morning, the Canadian Ministry of Finance released what they called a comprehensive tariff response package. Our sources are confirming these are economic measures and duties not deployed in over 8 decades.
This action is a clear signal to Washington, it says. Diplomacy has failed, our patience has ended, and Canada views this as a defensive economic necessity. They have put the White House on immediate notice that the old rules of engagement are finished.
So the primary duties were already enormous. A 25% duty on American-made vehicles, 25% on automotive parts, and another 25% on the steel components. But the element that turned this into a surgical strike, the detail that truly caught everyone off guard, was this additional 15% surcharge.
That extra 15% is the entire ballgame. And we really need to pause on it because it defines Canada's entire strategic intent. It is specifically levied on any vehicle containing components that have previously benefited from U.S. government subsidies. So Canada isn't just reacting to existing U.S. tariffs, they are directly weaponizing their border against major U.S. industrial policies.
So we're talking about targeting legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act or the THBS Act. For our listeners who might not track every piece of legislation, can you just break down what Canada is really hitting here?
Yeah, clarity is crucial. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, it contains massive incentives, especially for electric vehicles, for batteries, renewable energy, and they're specifically tied to domestic content rules, meaning components have to be sourced and made in North America, often prioritizing the U.S. The whole goal of the IRA was to onshore supply chains and create industrial dominance.
And Canada is now directly taxing the success of that strategy.
They're saying if a U.S. manufacturer uses highly subsidized American-made EV batteries, which the IRA encourages, the total cost of exporting that car to Canada just shot up to a minimum of 40%. That's the 25% general duty plus the 15% surcharge. This makes that vehicle instantly, completely non-competitive in the Canadian market. It's a massive, immediate cost calculation that throws Washington's entire America First strategy into complete financial chaos.
So Canada is demanding that the U.S. foot the bill for their own internal subsidy programs when those subsidized products try to cross the border. That is devastating.
And completely justifiable from Ottawa's perspective. They view the IRA's domestic content rules as a kind of subtle protectionism that violates the spirit of the Integrated Continental Agreement. They just refuse to stand by while the U.S. subsidized their own manufacturing base at Canada's expense.
The fallout was instant. And, I mean, non-symbolic. Within just 6 hours of the announcement, we saw huge consequences. General Motors stock dropped a stunning 11%. Ford quickly suspended production announcements for 2 key plants in Michigan. And Stellantis. They issued emergency memos to suppliers. They're basically operating under crisis protocols, the kind meant for absorbing billions in unexpected losses.
And that reaction just shows the deep integration we were talking about.
Sure.
This wasn't some slow-moving trade barrier. It was immediate amputation. And let's connect those losses directly to that tariff structure. You've got Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. They all rely heavily on component exports to Canadian assembly plants. So when those tariffs hit, the demand for Michigan-made component parts just evaporated overnight because the Canadian plants couldn't afford them, which leads to instant layoff fears. We're talking about analysts projecting, 40,000 potential job losses in Michigan alone if this lasts a year?
But wait, doesn't this boomerang back on them? Analysts must be pointing out the risk here. I mean, fracturing the supply chain has to hurt Ontario plants that rely on Ohio engines, right?
That is absolutely the central high-risk calculation Canada made. Of course it hurts them. They're absorbing significant short-term pain. Their own economy will slow down. But they calculated that the long-term pain of American economic dominance combined with the instability of U.S. trade policy, that was the greater threat. They're treating a fractured supply chain as a necessary cost to gain policy independence.
And meanwhile, we heard the Canadian finance minister state flatly that Canada will not be bullied, will not be threatened, and will not accept a trading relationship that treats them as subordinate. That language is a profound shift.
It signals a geopolitical coming of age, really. For decades, Canada accepted American dominance as sort of the cost of proximity and military protection. They have now publicly rejected that entire cost structure.
And that shift is what made the White House response so urgent, so reactive, and ultimately so hostile. They didn't propose negotiation or compromise. They just immediately threatened escalation. Additional tariffs on Canadian lumber, restrictions on energy imports, and this is the most shocking part, threatening to invoke national security provisions against Canada.
The boldness of that maneuver, given their military alliance, is what surprised most observers. I mean, we are talking about Canada, a partner in NORAD, a partner in NATO, a country that helped secure American airspace after 9/11. The U.S. response was almost pathologically antagonistic.
The irony here is just staggering. The United States started this trade war. They imposed tariffs first, citing national security concerns about Canadian steel. And now the U.S. acts completely surprised when Canada retaliates with a far more precise and damaging measure.
It's economic policy made by political impulse, not by sound thinking. They just assumed that because they are the largest economy, they could impose costs without incurring any serious reciprocal damage. Well, that assumption has just proven fatal to their domestic auto industry. This isn't how you resolve disputes. This is how you fracture alliances.
So we've seen the immediate shockwaves in Detroit and the hostile reaction in Washington. But our sources indicate this chaos wasn't isolated. It seems like other trading partners were watching and maybe just waiting for Canada to make the first move.
That's the deeper story here. Analysts are framing Canada's maneuver as a strategic decoupling. It's a deliberate, phased effort to reduce their economic dependency on what they now clearly view as an unreliable partner. And crucially, the tariffs were calibrated to inflict maximum political pain in U.S. swing states.
These aren't just vote centers. These are the legacy centers of the American auto industry. So Canada is directly threatening the communities that symbolize America First manufacturing strength.
Precisely. And this action catalyzed this wider multilateral resistance, all within that shocking 72-hour window. Mexico announced they are actively reviewing retaliatory options against U.S. agricultural exports. The European Union accelerated the implementation of their own long-delayed counter-tariffs. Even Japan started increasing scrutiny of U.S. auto imports, suddenly citing new safety compliance issues.
It's like a domino effect. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that for years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that its economic centrality was this unshakable shield, that it was too big, too central to be effectively challenged.
That assumption is failing right now. It's being tested by a collective, coordinated response from its largest trading partners. The message from the international trading system is unified. We will no longer tolerate unilateral protectionism.
And that puts Washington in an incredibly high-stakes, vulnerable position. The president is under enormous political pressure. You've got hardliners wanting more tariffs, unions wanting protection, and consumers just wanting affordable cars. Leaders facing sudden economic shocks, hemorrhaging support in the industrial Midwest. They respond from vulnerability, not from strength.
And that's exactly when trade disputes become geopolitical crises. The U.S. policy failure forced its closest ally to treat it as an adversary just to protect its own economic base. But now we have to look at Canada's resolve, because they are not folding.
The Prime Minister addressed Parliament, and he stated forcefully, Canada did not start this trade war, but Canada will finish it. And public support in Canada is reportedly very strong, mainly because Canadians genuinely feel disrespected by the U.S. approach over the last few years.
That public support is the key. It gives the government the political room to sustain these punishing tariffs indefinitely. This has become a test of pure economic resolve. Canada wants a serious, binding negotiation. The U.S. wants to demonstrate that tariffs are an effective pressure tool. And American workers, meanwhile, are caught precisely between Canadian retaliation and American political stubbornness.
And you can see the industry is scrambling right now to mitigate the damage. Sources confirm GM has already begun rerouting component orders away from their long-term Canadian suppliers. Ford is exploring emergency sourcing agreements with Mexican and Asian manufacturers. The integrated supply chain that took 3 decades to build is fracturing in real time.
Yet Washington is doubling down. Their response has been consistently hostile, consistently escalatory, refusing to negotiate under duress. This sends a message to American manufacturers that they are effectively on their own to solve a trade war that was started by policymakers. It is the economic equivalent of fighting fire with gasoline, and the manufacturers are getting burned.
The deepest concern among analysts, the one that's really worrying officials the most, is the possibility of what they're calling the post-American bloc.
This is the strategic pivot. Canada is moving aggressively to reduce its dependency by imposing these real, immediate costs on the U.S. But at the same time, they are accelerating trade negotiations and pushing for deep economic integration with Europe, with the TPP nations, with the U.K. They are essentially creating a high-standard trading circle that intentionally minimizes and bypasses reliance on the often erratic U.S. market.
So it's not just a tariff. It's an attempted fundamental rewriting of global economic geography. And the mood is, Ottawa is calm, secure in its resolved position. Washington, on the other hand, is panicking.
Absolutely. The key takeaways from the past 72 hours are indelible. Canada demonstrated serious resolve, precise targeting of U.S. vulnerabilities, and coordination with other trading partners. They have shown they have viable alternatives and are no longer willing to accept a trade relationship built on American policy dominance and Canadian submission. The American auto industry is already bleeding, and the only path forward is the one based on negotiation, partnership, and mutual respect.
So what does this all mean for you? The United States thought its economic centrality was an unshakable shield. Now, having treated its closest ally with what Canada clearly perceived as contempt, is the damage to North American manufacturing integration already irreversible?
And that raises the really important question. Is Canada now fundamentally rewriting the rules of continental trade for the next generation? Are they forcing the U.S. to permanently choose between the success of its isolationist industrial policy goals and the stability of its northern border? What stands out to you as the biggest failure in Washington's calculation? That's the thought we'll leave you with tonight.